Yeah, so hello everyone. Probably get started. It's a little after 11. Um, yeah, so this is the traffic fallacy. And a little bit about me. I am Sean. I work at Last Call Media. I'm a senior producer and an agile coach there. So kind of a little bit about what that means is I help the organizations that we work with figure out what's next, and at the same time help as best as I can, reduce the amount of friction that can sometimes be involved in software development. And then, of course, I love finding myself in a retrospective, helping teams go from good to great, talking about things that make sense to continue doing and things to improve. And yeah, so a little bit about us. As at Last Call Media, we enjoy doing work with purpose, right? Helping build tools that help organizations improve their communities. So a little while ago, I was stuck in some traffic. I live in New York, so it's actually a pretty common thing for me. And I was sitting there, and I was thinking to myself, why is this, in a city with 8 million people, why is this still not a solved problem? So I began looking into it, and I came across a pretty interesting story. In 2004, right, in Houston, which is where this is from, this photo, had a major traffic problem, right? The city was experiencing massive population growth, and its roads and its infrastructure hadn't really caught up with the increase in population. So traffic just kept getting worse and worse. The Katy Freeway, which is Interstate 10, runs from downtown Houston to the city's growing suburbs, almost 30 miles to the west. And this little journey took an average of 41 minutes to go those 28 miles, right, which is a pretty long time. So there was a study done by the American Highway Association, which is a thing I learned, and they published their findings that, in their opinion, the Katy Freeway in Houston, Texas, was the second most congested road in America. Right? This is just an undesirable state of affairs. This is terrible. So measured, right, by how bad this freeway was in terms of traffic, drivers sit an average of 25 million hours a year on the road, going nowhere, doing nothing, sitting in traffic, right? You're not adding any value to your life, right? You're sitting there listening, maybe catching up on a podcast. And out of curiosity, how many hours is 25 million hours? That's like 40 lifetimes a year spent in traffic on this one road. So to put a dollar on it, because sometimes that is a little bit more relatable, let's assume that the average rider has the opportunity to spend that time earning, on average, $20 an hour on something else, right? So the direct net economic loss is something like $500 million a year, right? Simple math. And that, of course, doesn't include things like the indirect costs like fuel, or shipping costs or anything else that gets compounded by the amount of time spent in traffic. That's just that one road. Doing some simple math, and I struggled with, like, does this even really make sense? Because, but just throwing a dollar amount and multiplying it by the number of hours, that's $500 million of economic loss, right? Those people could be working, they could be employed, doing all sorts of other things, hanging out with their kids. So the study concluded that bottlenecks are caused by too many cars on too little road, and that's what's to blame here. Traffic accidents, work zones, bad weather, and poor signals, those things account for the rest. So that was their recommendation. That was their diagnosis, rather. And so the team was like, oh yeah, bottlenecks, that's something we can fix. We can fix half these issues. The other half seem to be kind of totally random and unpredictable, difficult to account for. But perhaps if we solve the first half, things will be better for when the second half comes into effect. So the conclusion was too many cars and not enough freeway. And so someone with the best intentions probably said something along the lines of extra capacity would surely solve this problem. More lanes would mean more room for more cars, which would then mean shorter travel time. Seems reasonable. So therefore, let's build more freeway. So where the story got interesting was how much money they spent. So they spent $2.8 billion, the state of Texas, to widen the freeway in certain parts to 26 lanes. It's a lot of money. A lot of lanes. The one problem with that, though, was that the congestion on the Katy actually has become worse since that expansion, right? So how could that possibly be? That kind of flies in the face of what we thought was common sense. So travel times 1 year after, when they measured it again, increased 55%. So 64 minutes to go that same 28 miles that previously took 41 minutes. So I think one of the things that we think about here was perhaps it wasn't the same amount of cars, right? Because the population was growing. So it wasn't just that they widened more lanes and the number of cars remained the same. They widened to become more lanes, but the number of cars also increased. So they kind of maintained that same car to freeway ratio. And of course, this isn't just a problem in Texas. This is a problem all over the world. This is a shot of the Hong Kong-Macau 50-lane expressway, right? You can have a lot of fun Google imaging traffic. And this was like one like afternoon in the summer as people were coming back. But wait, obviously, the people who design these freeways, they're not malicious. They have the best intentions, right? For all we know, the freeway engineers are the people who are making these recommendations are saying, hey, we don't build more lanes. Don't build more lanes. Solve this a different way. There was more of a disclosure just in case there are any freeway engineers in the room. You never know. So yeah, despite the capacity increases, right? Too many vehicles in progress means continued high road utilization, high throughput, and idling vehicles. Sorry. Right, so when the freeway is full, right, there's no room for to account for any of those variations in vehicles that lead to things like accidents, slowdowns, bottlenecks. So there's no freeway slack. There needs to be slack in this freeway system, or space in the road, right, to account for the inevitable variations that exist between vehicles, right? Vehicles are different sizes, people drive different speeds, different skill levels. Some people text while they drive on the freeway. Some people merge lanes more aggressively than others, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All that variation, right? And it's consistent with software development, right? We have a lot of variation in our work, right? One task to do some simple security updates versus, say, rolling out a feature for a blog. Totally different tasks. So I think, and there's a lot of research out there, a lot of academic literature to suggest this, freeways need a VIP, right? A vehicle in progress limit. So instead of increasing the amount of road, if we instead limited the number of vehicles on the road at any given time, we could then create slack, create that space so that we can account for all the different variations in vehicles. And cities know this. Cities like New York, I found, have been trying to solve their traffic problem for years, right? Mayor Bloomberg notoriously tried to roll out a tax to enter in Manhattan during certain times to limit the number of people entering the city. Congestion pricing, I think, is what it was called. Unsuccessful, right? It's still in progress. But Stockholm had a unique challenge, right? They were experiencing rapid population growth, much like Houston, but unlike Houston, they're a city of essentially islands. So they couldn't then just build wider freeways. They were stuck with this, with the amount of roads that they had. So they set up a time-boxed experiment and set a $1 toll to enter the main city area, hoping to reduce congestion. It was fiercely political, fiercely contested, and when people saw the data after that experiment, the results were that an average travel time decreased by 50%, and in addition, this fun little bonus, emissions in the inner city dropped 14 to 18%. So it became faster to get to where you needed to go, and then when you got there, the air was cleaner. So they ended up instituting that, making that a thing. So now there's essentially congestion pricing to enter in the city of Stockholm during certain periods of the day. But anyway, enough of talking about highways in Stockholm and Houston. What about our freeways, right? Our highways are kind of like queues in software development. So where a lot of times we find it may make sense when a project's behind schedule, when there's a lot going on, and progress seems to not be moving forward, perhaps we should put more people, get more people involved, throw more developers on it, manage it better, et cetera, et cetera. But an obvious, and then thinking about things like a WIP limit or a work in progress limit can seem counterintuitive, or perhaps there are social and political structures in place that kind of work against instituting any kind of policy like that. So how many of us perhaps have looked at their backlog or their task list and thought, wow, this is taking forever and nothing's getting done, right? No judgment against the people on your team. Everyone's working, doing the best that they can. right? But things just aren't moving forward, right? And then you took perhaps a closer look, and you came across, and you started thinking, well, maybe we need more people. Let's get more people because there are a lot of tasks. And then, upon closer look, you found that you had team members with greater than one thing assigned to them. All those things that were taking forever to do, well, they've been assigned to that same person who works 9 to 5 and is working really hard, and their task list just keeps getting longer and longer and longer. And the thing that you need is somewhere on that list, and there's no end in sight. So that was kind of what we were experiencing as an organization. We found that people, worked really hard, did the best that they could. They were incredibly busy. Stress was really high, and value, essentially what people were paying us for as an organization, was just taking too long to get to the customer, to get into production, to get into a spot where we could get feedback on it and perhaps do additional refinements to it, etc. So we were taking too long to learn anything about the work that we were doing because things were just sitting in queues. And when people look at their task list, they come in every morning, that's kind of stressful. So you kind of have an impact here, not only on value taking a while to get to the customer, but also on morale, right? Like, oh, wow, I always have 80 things assigned to me. That's just the normal state of affairs. So that was kind of, are these things mutually exclusive, right? Can you be busy and be delivering value to the customer at the same time, or can you only be one or the other? So we, took a look around, and again, we noticed that task variation makes it really difficult to provide any kind of accurate predictions when you're looking at, someone's list of 80 things or a team's list of 80 things that are all in progress. It can be difficult to make any predictions as to when anything will get done. So in addition to that, we have a bunch of secondary needs that were created, right? You need customer service people, you need accounts people, you need additional project managers to deal with things like customer expectations, when is something going to be done, dealing with dissatisfied folks who are like, this has been I've been waiting for this thing for like 3 weeks, what's going on here? So this is essentially superfluous work. It's not adding any value to the organization, right? We can figure out a way to perhaps, by changing the way that we work and the way that we approach projects, remove this need. So here's kind of where we were coming from. I don't think we were very command and control, but I think from the textbook business side of things, it would be considered command and control management, right? You need to keep people busy 100% in order to get things done. Assign work to people, and then once it's assigned, you then manage it. Looking a little light today, think you can add a few more things, and someone probably say, well, I don't think I'm going to get all of it done today. It's like, it's okay, there's tomorrow. Just keep it all on your list. Are you sure that's enough? You look a little hungry, here's a little bit more. And we all right. Oh yeah, so the goal of project management essentially was to make sure everyone always had a full plate of work. That meant project management was doing its job. So we thought perhaps there's a different way of doing this, and so we don't have $2 billion, so like the city of Houston and the state of Texas. So how can we kind of work with what we have, kind of where we are with the people that already work here, and try to improve things? So instead, what if we transitioned from focusing on keeping everyone busy to instead delivering work to the customer as quickly as possible, right? And there's something that we say around the office from time to time, right? How can we put that good idea into action quickly, right? Is another way, perhaps fewer words to describe that, right? Because an idea is really just an idea until it's sitting on production, and you can learn something about it, and then get more ideas, throw that into a backlog, and get those changes into production quickly. So one of the first things that we did as a team, right, is we kind of had queues in all sorts of different spots. So this is several years ago. We started putting up boards around the office to visualize our process, kind of understand what are all the different states that a task can be in, right? And so the team would then meet around that every morning for like a daily stand-up, sort of review, hey, here's all the work that's in the backlog. We have all these different states, to do, doing, done, for the simple ones. So it provided that high-level visibility of kind of all the work that was in progress for the team, right? Those bottlenecks or things that kind of got stuck somewhere became a little easier to see. They weren't hiding, on someone's to-do list, in their software as they sat at their desk. and we're just working on it really hard for 3 days, and you didn't really have any visibility into or the opportunity for other people to help them out. And of course, one of the other added benefits here is it made hidden work apparent. So when someone had a chore or like an update to do or something like that, hey, let's throw that on the board, rather than having it stuck in someone's head. Great. And the second thing that we did was after we had that board, it became really easy for people just to take things and kind of like pull things onto themselves. And then we still had that problem where in doing, there were maybe been 3 or 4 people on that team, but doing had 10 things in it, right? So it's like, how many things can you really work on at one time? This needs to represent what's actually being worked on. So we experimented with different work in progress limits, right? Because high levels of work in progress heightens distraction, right? It decreases concentration and kind of makes it a little bit easier to perhaps abandon the task if you have other tasks that you can be working on. It's like, oh, this one's just a little too tricky, or I'm not really feeling this one today. Maybe I'll jump to this one because it's assigned to me. Bottlenecks, again, become clear fast. If you have we'll see examples of this, but if you have a column with a WIP limit of 3 and you still have those same 3, perhaps that serves as a signal that something needs to be looked into. We also realize that there's not really one right work in progress limit for a team, right? This is more of a conversation that the team has as a team itself, right? But there are some like rules of thumb. A lower work in progress limit is generally better, right? We like smaller teams, dinner party size, probably around 4 to 6 people. When you have too high of a work in progress limit, work becomes idle. It just sits in a queue. And too low of a WIP limit may then lead to people with nothing to do. If they're not, right, we talk about these dinner party sized teams, and a lot of times they're multidisciplinary. So there are people with certain strengths, and there are certain people who are still working on those strengths or developing those strengths. So they may not be a good fit for something. So they're just idle while they wait for something that's probably a better fit for them. Great. So then how do we represent kind of all these different, we talk about that car going down that freeway, right? What does that look like in terms of our freeways, our queues? So we have a card, right? The symbol of a task to be done. And then we use these cards and they move through the board, right? So we like when we're remote now, so that has a whole set of different challenges. But when we were all kind of in the same office, this would actually be a physical card that was on the board that got moved throughout. And there was a way to like represent that card in another tool like Jira. So you'd reference that Jira ticket, right? So this was just a quick sort of signal for what that or a quick sign for what that task was, and you can move it through. And if you wanted more information, you wanted to dig deeper into it, you could have a conversation about it, or you'd go back and you look in Jira. And so getting started, right? We took our list of work, right? We had no shortage of work, a lot of tasks kind of in different states, right? And the second thing that we did was we prioritized it based on the business value, right? How important are these things to getting into production, right? That's essentially a prioritized list of things is essentially a backlog, in terms of its minimum viable state. Those are really the 2 things that you need. Teams work from the top of that list to the bottom, right? Based on its priority. And then they self-organize. They depending on kind of what process you have in place. You may have a planning meeting, right, to set up your 2-week sprint, or perhaps you're not, doing sprints. You're just working on things. You're on a support team and you're pulling things in and you're working on things as they come in. But the team itself kind of self-organizes to figure out how to pull the work from one end through the other. So here's a really simple board, right? Have any of you used Trello? Probably you get this kind of right out of the box. So it's simple, right? This doesn't really match any complex software development project, but as a simple place to start. When we started doing this, right, you could easily read a lot of literature, hear from a lot of industry experts, and they've got these really, refined, complex boards, right? But the team kind of built that from the ground up, perhaps, and along the way, that's how that board became the way that it was. So I think a lot of times by adding a lot of that complexity in the beginning, by making those really complex boards, it can then be difficult to then pull that out. So we like to start simple. So this, I think, for like the first, when we started doing this, I think the first week or 2 weeks, the board actually looked like this, and then people started saying, "Hey, where should I put like, ready for deployment, or like where should I put testing? Where should all these different things go?" And then we kind of added that naturally as a team. So then, yeah, I pull cup 134 to me and stand up. I've decided that this is what I'm working on today. Pull it over to myself. No one assigned it to me. I've decided that I'm a good fit for this. I've talked about it with the team. Team either explicitly agrees or says sure, go for it. And I'm done. I move it over to done. Really simple, right? We've probably all done this. But then we have a situation here that's far too common sometimes on teams where I said I would work on one thing at a time, right? I explicitly stated that. I've got a WIP limit of 1, and now I've got 3 things in progress, and it's looked like that for a week. And the trick there is nothing is actually getting to done, right? I have so many things in progress that I'm not getting anything to done. In that same amount of time where I had shipped 1 thing, I now have 3 things that I'm waiting on. So here's a more complicated board, right? You've got a lot of explicit WIP limits here, right? To do, that's kind of where your incoming work sits. The team may review that. Someone's accountable for making sure that that's ready for the team. The team then works to make tasks available, kind of pulls them over to analyze or selected to development. Again, the team kind of decided what each one of these columns means. So this also helped us with something else that we were working on, which was that some people had too much on their plate and others with not enough, right? Because I think the team perhaps lacked visibility into the system that they were a part of, or the process that they were a part of. So when the team could look at something like this, the conversations became a little easier for people to say something like, "Oh, I could probably take cup 147 if I got a little help with this part," right? And then the team kind of works together to help move that task through. And of course, you try to go one direction. And one thing that was actually pretty great when we started this process was our queue hygiene was already pretty good, right? You'd think twice before driving down a road like this, right? So your queue should also be roadworthy. A lot of times it could be easy just to throw stuff in there. They become, kind of like a rat's nest of tasks. Are things are things written in such a way where people kind of understand what's going on and have a path for figuring out more about what that task is. Um, you can't go talk about moving quickly and getting things into action quickly. It's really difficult to think about going 60 miles an hour down this road, right? So your queues kind of need to be clearly organized. It needs to make sense what each column means. The team needs to understand what each column means. Otherwise, you're just essentially wasting time navigating around all that mess. So we didn't have to change everything about how we worked. There were things that we were doing that made a lot of sense to continue doing and that really supported this new way of thinking. And then there were, of course, some things that we decided we should experiment with changing. So one thing that we decided, we had multifunctional teams, right? So multidisciplinary teams. So we had a combination of, for example, on one team, perhaps a really senior Drupal developer complemented by someone who was, just getting started, perhaps, and perhaps you'd even have a creative person on that team, a UX person, to help quickly remove any sort of impediments during that daily stand-up. That team was dedicated, so they weren't distracted by external projects. We've seen sometimes where you have a build team and they're just also dealing with like ongoing support requests from projects that they shipped and kind of wrapped up months ago. Queue hygiene, queues kind of were fairly clean. They made sense. Tasks were consistent. We had daily stand-ups and also retrospectives on a weekly or biweekly cadence. And of course, things changed. Instead of optimizing for everyone being super busy, we optimized for trying to get a single task through the process as quickly as possible, right? Where team members were attached to the work rather than the work being attached to the team member. And team members then kind of pull that work through the system. So a little bit of what this looks like in the diagram was you have a team member here, and they've got all these different flow units kind of assigned to them. So this is one person with essentially 3 things assigned to them. That team member is always busy, right? If you kind of put a camera on their shoulder, right, they're just constantly going from one task to the next task to the next task. 100% utilization. But if you kind of flip the camera on that actual task, that task, there'd be states where it was busy, and then there are states where it's just doing nothing. So we switched to uh, continue trying to push this. There are some struggles with this, but to a more flow efficiency type model where you have a bunch of team members who are working on one thing, trying to get that one thing through the system. So you perhaps on the shoulder of the team member, there are some moments where the team member may not be doing anything, but if you have a camera on the shoulder of that flow unit is always busy, right? It's constantly moving through that system. So that, as an organization, was more important to us, getting that flow unit or getting that idea through the system as quickly as possible instead of having that team member be super busy all the time. And then there's this great book that I highly recommend called This is Lean, right? And it describes, or defines rather, flow efficiency as this idea of the sum of value-adding activities in relation to the throughput time. So some words there, but essentially value-adding time would be time where someone is actually actively working on something, and throughput time is the time from when the idea starts to when it's in production. So flow efficiency, right, achieving that is about reducing our non-value-adding activities, like waiting, right? So someone asks for something, it sits in a queue for a really long time, and because everyone has 3 things assigned to them, things take forever to get to move to the different states. So we didn't hire more people. We hired more people, but not because we had to, not to solve this problem, but because we were growing and we had a lot of different projects. But we didn't hire more people and throw them into the same project, essentially. So as an example here, right, as an admin, I want to be able to enable site-wide notifications so visitors can see important alerts like changes to the schedule, right, snow day, closing early, this or that. So the value-adding time here was the time spent with creative and development. So let's just say it took, based on the way that this site was built and the way that the team worked, actually really it's only 8 hours worth of work. But because of the way the work is organized in terms of how the team moves things through their process, it actually sat around for a lot. So it actually took 120 hours from when the initial request was made to being live on production. So we achieved like a 6 2/3 flow efficiency rate right there. So that's like a metric, right, that you can use in a conversation to talk about, what happened here? Is this desirable? Is there a way that this number can be moved a little bit? But again, considering that there's a lot of variation in tasks, you may never get, it's highly unlikely that you'll get the same task again on the same site under those same conditions. But it's more of like a, hey, what do we think about this? And achieving a different state here, thinking about this differently, focusing on flow, right? That same team spent that same amount of time, but by limiting our work in progress, one person works on one thing at a time, right? And visualizing our workflow, that idea came in, and then 3 days later, it was live on production, right? That was a really quick turnaround. So that delivers a lot more, like, as the customer, I'm a lot happier now that took 3 days. And from a business side of, from the business side of the house, we didn't have to hire more people to get that done faster. We didn't have to, stress anyone out a little bit more. No one had to work nights or weekends. Just kind of worked with what we had, right? So here are some examples of where you are adding value-adding time. So under analyze, for example, when the team's kind of reviewing the work, when something's in progress, when you're testing it, but when things are sitting in the to-do column or selected for development or ready for deployment, they're not adding any time, they're not adding any value, but the clock is still ticking. So you could use this as an example in a retrospective. Say, hey, what can we do as a team to reduce the amount of time things sit in these different columns? And the team may say, hey, look, we don't really have the tools that we need, or hey, the way that this organization that we're working with is set up, we have to essentially push everything to them, and they only release on Thursdays. So that's kind of out of our hands. But here's an opportunity, to perhaps change that so that we can be deploying things continuously. Yeah, so things move from to do to analyze. Right. So talking a little bit about retrospectives, one of the ways to think about, hey, so we've got this board, to do, doing, and done, fairly limiting, not really an accurate representation of how we're working. Perhaps we need to add another column here, or perhaps you added a column for when the team was in a certain state, but as they continue working together, they realize that they don't need that column anymore. So it's important, in those examples, to have not only feedback loops on the work that's being shipped, but also how the team is working. So retrospectives have become a really important conversation that we have on the different teams, right? So some teams have them weekly, other teams have them bi-weekly, and there are a lot of different great ways to facilitate these retrospectives. There's a book, Good to Great, I think it's called, that kind of gives a couple different models, but essentially, right, set the stage, why are we all here? What are we here to talk about? We just spent the last week. It was a pretty stressful week, in my opinion, curious to hear what other people think. We used Confluence, so we would set up like a retrospective. We have a retrospective template in Confluence, set that up, invite everyone to it, spend the first 5 to 10 minutes or so. People will write in kind of what their thoughts were on that retrospective as a team, going to generate any sort of insights. Are there things that people are repeating? Are a lot of people saying the same thing? Prioritize those insights. Hey, a lot of people said that this queue is too simple. A lot of people said that it was really difficult to get things into production. There's 2 simple examples. And then the team kind of works together to decide what to do there. Then close the retrospective, right? So like we use Confluence. One of the things that we found is in the beginning we used to do retrospectives. When we would do retrospectives, we wouldn't document them. And people were pretty excited about retrospectives in general, just having that loop. But we weren't documenting them, so it became difficult to know if we were continuing to talk about the same thing week after week after week, or if we were really improving, right? Because it can feel really good to talk about things as a team, about ways to improve, but you also want to make sure that you're not just talking about things are actually improving. And one of my favorite little activities that I wish we did more is like a return on time invested, right? So just a 1 to 5. Hey, this was really helpful. 5 being, hey, this was super helpful for me. I got a lot out of this. 1 being like, I don't really understand why I was here. This is like total waste of my time, right? Because it's important to make sure that you're not just having these retrospectives because Scrum, for example, prescribes this retrospective. Yeah, so kind of a little bit to sum up what we learned. We started with what we had, right? With the people that we had being the right people, the tools that we had being the right tools, and the space that we had being the space that we had. Giant office in Hampton. These giant lists of things that were assigned to one person. We kind of started slowly unassigning all those things and instead prioritizing those things, and then visualize that our process. So we put up a board, very simple board. Then we instituted work in progress limits. Hey, this team is 4 people. Perhaps the work in progress limit should be 4 because I don't know how 4 people can work on 5 things at the same time. And then we continue to and have really gotten a lot of value as a team and as an organization out of retrospectives on how to improve. And Agile and Lean, all this thinking that we've been talking about, are all about experimentation and learning, right? So there's no end destination that you're constantly working to. It's just constantly a journey that'll never end, right? So sit down, buckle up, and enjoy it. And yeah, thanks. So landed that with enough time for questions or comments, or if folks are doing things they want to talk about.
Question. So when you're talking about having that one board just to show what all the work in progress for everybody, I imagine you have multiple projects going on at the same time. So did you have like everything from every project going in there, or did you have like a board for each project?
Yeah, so we have different teams. So if it's a production, like a build, that will be its own board for its own team. And we have another team working on another build will have its own board for that team. So those 2 boards aren't really combined. And then they'll have their own retrospectives, they'll have their own conversations about what makes sense to do on their board for that project. But we also have one of the things that we realized was even doing that, those ongoing support things would come to that build team who had already committed to working on those build tasks. and now they're like, hey, here's this site that you built like a year and a half ago, and it needs those core updates done or something like that. So that would come in, and that would really jeopardize those commitments. So we transitioned to what we call the SLA team, which is essentially a team that's not scheduled on any build projects. And that team works on those types of tasks so that the other teams can maintain their commitments. So they have a shared board with multiple projects in it in terms of like sites, but in terms of builds and project work, those are separate.
You ever run into a situation where, like, even if it's one board for a project, it just becomes like the backlog is too big, that
Yep.
you sort of want to, there's a tendency to want to like split it into different, maybe it's like by back end stack, front end stack, other ways. There's other ways you could potentially slice and dice a single project.
Yeah.
Do you ever do that? Do you sort of like, for the sake of the benefits of this sort of kind of granular flow model, which is really cool, it's worth it to just keep everything in one board?
Yeah, so there's no, we've definitely run into those situations where the board becomes super bloated, and there's no like, we don't then just walk into the room and say, okay, well, we need separate boards. It's more of a, hey, how, like as a team, right? Like, can we figure out if this is a problem for us? Like bloated as the way you described it makes it sound like it's a problem. Yeah, so there's like backlog management, right? So like, are there really 150 things, or the stakeholders just have an opportunity to put all their wish list items in that?
Maybe that's board.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's like different ways of approaching that, where some people, like one argument would be it shouldn't be in the system until it's approved and it's ready. Making that explicit could totally help. And then we've also been in conversations where people are like, yeah, but I can't control my stakeholders, and they want to be able to write things and put things into Jira. So then it's like, I think I had a.
So you're filling up your board with the stories, but the tasks aren't necessarily associated yet with the stories.
Sure, yeah. So you have your story, and then the team meets and breaks it up into tasks for sure. So you could. So is the question there that?
Well, how you limit the tasks. So if you have a project and you pull the stories in front, very general, if you have the stories in front, then everybody's aware of the scope, stakeholder, team. Then as you're trying to manage this flow, then you're just creating the tasks that flow those units, and you're assigning it to the people just incrementally, right? So that's not you don't have this huge backlog of stories, but not backlog.
Right, you could. That's where it would start, right? So the stakeholder or the product owner or the product manager would create a story and put that in one of these queues, and then the team may have a planning cadence every 2 weeks, or they may plan on demand. Like, hey, look, we've got about a dozen stories here. We've already planned these. We've already got those tasks broken out, so we're feeling pretty good about the next couple of days worth of work, right? It's a conversation, and then they may say, hey, we should probably throw a planning meeting on Thursday or something like that in that daily stand-up, so that we can review what's in the backlog, right? Make sure that it's prioritized prior to, and break those up into tasks, right? And then, of course, if this is a project, definitely a good idea to start off with that planning, like a higher level planning meeting, to introduce what the overall agenda, like the overall goal of the project is, to give it some vision and directionality, so that people have some idea of the implication of their decisions as they make them.
So is there a hidden column of stories, or is that usually a separate content, separate medium? Whatever it is, Trello or Jira.
We've worked on, and that's again fiercely political, but we worked on projects where we, that line of thinking, like, hey, it shouldn't be in the system until it's ready. It's like, oh, okay, so I can, figure that out somewhere else, right? I may create one project that I'm working on. There's 2 projects in Jira. One is like almost like a stakeholder management project, where the stakeholders can put all their wishes and desires in there, and then the product owner team, right, takes them and fleshes them out, makes them real. Like, what does it make sense here? And they have a little board for that. And then when it comes out, whatever story comes out of that, then actually makes it to the development or the creative board.
Right. So that there's a lot of variation on what leads to a distilled action to do here.
Yeah.
Okay, a lot of ways that can be scaled.
Absolutely. And then on other projects, the stakeholders like, actually, I want to be able to put things directly into the to-do column for the team. Yeah. So
So with what you guys were just talking about, kind of like Stockholm charging $1.
yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you have any optics or politics maybe for the process change to prioritize flow that the stakeholder wants to see all the developer, oh, the developer has 6 to-dos, it means they're getting a lot done and they're very attached to that process.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, how do you handle that with your
Great question. So I could speak to as an organization internally how that went, and perhaps how we've helped other organizations with that one. But I'd say that the line of thinking had been like the mantra when we rolled out this line of thinking was that was status quo, that you just had a lot of things assigned to you. So it really took like it was a challenging change from like a change management perspective. People were like, this is the way that we're working. We've been working this way for a while. Like, what is this line of thinking of flow? What is flow? You know, snake oil was thrown out as a term. So it was an interesting transition. But I think what really helped with that, this may not be totally touching on your question, is the retrospectives. By making those a thing, and of course the first few were kind of like, I think hokey pokey was a term, but we really stuck with it, and it's been several years, and it's really transitioned kind of how we work, and really helped, I think, with what you're talking about.
but it's helpful with the change management. Well, not to say it means I'm not good at my job, and I think that's hard.
Heard that one too.
Like,
Yeah.
there's internal pressure and then also
Yep. True. Another challenge too is like those. I'm not too sure with the organization, but like stakeholders in those retrospectives, that could be challenging as well. If in terms of like the safety of the team and feeling like, hey, because that what you were describing is if I don't have 6 things assigned to me, I'm going to get fired or something like that. They may not feel like talking about that if the stakeholder who may or may not have hired them or runs their or signs their paycheck is in that room and they're like, hey, can I have one thing assigned to me at once? That'd be a really great idea. And that stakeholder's like, no way, 9 things assigned to you.
we've tried to cut the whole retro.
Yeah.
That kind of has a cycle.
Cool. We've experimented with and had mild success with having the external team in our retrospectives. I think we've done that like a few times. But again, you run into that safety thing where like as an organization, we want to be pushing excellence.
Yeah.
And sometimes being in like how the sausage is made and those little nuances doesn't really protrude that.
How we can QA tickets the different process, you say one process, it gets to QA, you will see send that. So you got to look at the process, you might say this is something you work on to fix their problems.
Absolutely, yeah. So that's the team. The team would decide that one, right? So how do they want to, as a team, are they a team that says, hey, do you kick the same story back with comments, or do they want a new task associated with that story? Because you can have the story in any sort of column here, right, in the task.
We can take back the process, we don't get back.
I guess that would depend on the feedback, right? So it could go all the way back to do if it was a stakeholder feedback item that was like, yeah, we're never going to get to that. Sure. Then if it's the team may say that should go and select it for development. Yeah. Oh, again, perhaps no, definitely not. The team would pull that into in process, right? And I guess the one thing is that also just because it lands in one of these columns, the team could totally say, I would hope, hey, this should actually go back to do, or this doesn't belong in this column, right?
You're also staying along. Hey,
Yeah.
There's a problem. I can't move forward when you guys get a second. Like, there's a lot of
automatic.
a lot of conversation.
Yeah, ideally, right, you have the amount of tasks that are actually in progress is reduced significantly. So the team being relatively small, everyone on the team should be sort of semi-aware with what everyone's working on. So to the point of it just sitting in testing and there's a feedback item, the person who found that error could say and stand up, hey, I want to get this thing moved through. but I can't until this error is done. What should I do? And someone may say, oh, that's quick. Just leave it there. Or, again, a conversation.
Are you using, I can talk to them step, but are you using level effort scale of some kind?
Like
Or
estimation, story points.
points?
Yeah, so that's again up to the team. Certain teams use hours, some teams use t-shirt sizes, but all sorts of different ways to. Sure. Yeah, right. Planning poker. We have even had those deck cards. So some teams do, but there's another team, the SLA team, and that's almost kind of a little bit irrelevant sometimes. It's just a thing to be done. So as long as it's smallish in size, it just gets pulled all the way through.
Like that.
Estimation.
Yeah.
I like estimation in terms of helping with the stakeholders, right? So like, hey, we can't do all these triple XLs. Yeah, right. Exactly. It'd be an interesting question for the team on whether or not they like. It helps them with commitments, like making sure that they're not taking on too much. But I've seen some teams just go straight up no estimates, and that's successful. But also, I've seen teams go, no estimates, and all of a sudden at the end, nothing's done, and you're like, what happened here? Yeah, yeah. Like, well, this one thing was actually 130 hours that snuck in. Yeah.
Nothing to do, all day to do it. Still not done at the end of the day.
Yeah. Cool. I think that's it for time, unless there are any other questions. Alrighty.